Welcome to Opera Notes. Today we have with us David Walsh. He is the arts editor for the World Socialist website. We usually talk to people who are directly involved in the production of opera and any of its different branches. But today we are talking with Mr. Walsh because he wrote an article about the recent bankruptcy of Syracuse Opera in New York, which unfortunately seems to be a trend within the United States and smaller opera companies. Mr. Walsh knows very well the cultural environment in the United States, and he's the author of a book about film titled "The Sky Between the Leaves," in which he analyzes the progressive abandonment of reality by cinema in the United States. So, Mr. Walsh, to introduce the topic, I want to bring this into the conversation. There is a book by an American economist by the name of Harry Schott I found many years ago at University of McGill Library in Montreal. The title of the book is "The Problem with Capitalism," in which I found probably the best definition of economics I've ever read in my life, which said, economics is the science of the production and administration of goods and services for a transcendental objective. So, with that in mind, would you say that this transcendental objective is being lost at the moment, not just in the United States, but also maybe in the rest of the world? Or what's happening with this transcendental objective?
Well, you're kind of assuming that I agree with that definition, but in any event, it's a big question. I mean, you're speaking to the arts editor of the World Socialist website, so I have a definite sociological and historical view of these things. But I think that in the most general sense, the crisis that we pointed to in that article, in one particular example, sort of beginning from the Syracuse Opera Company, speaks to a larger social and economic crisis and the decline, and above all, the decline and deterioration of American capitalism, the malignant growth of social inequality, the increased rule of the oligarch billionaires. Of course, we're only, 13 days from the new Trump administration, or the new Trump-Musk administration. We now have government of, by, and for the oligarchs. And what need does such a society have for opera and culture generally? I mean, Trump is speaking, as you know, I'm sure, about invading Mexico, seizing Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal. Now, you can say there's a wild and ludicrous element to this, but I wouldn't treat it as though it weren't a serious threat. You have a government of thieves and gangsters who understand the language of violence and plunder, lie and brag, and kill anyone who stands in your way. So, let's take as an illustration the Syracuse Opera situation. I did a little bit of consideration today. Okay, they went bankrupt with $340,000 in debt. Seems like a big amount of money to an opera singer or opera performer or opera manager. Opera America conducted a recent survey to which 156 companies responded, which is they claim is some 77% of Opera America's professional company membership. And their collective operating budgets total about $1.1 billion. And then they estimate, extrapolating from that with the other 23% added in, that the total collective opera budget in the United States would be $1.03 billion. Now, just for example, Elon Musk again, according to statistics, at least one statistic, this is apparently a conservative one, earns $54.55 million every day. This breaks down to $2.27 million per hour, $37,870 per minute, $631 per second. And if we consider an 8-hour day, then he makes $6.8 million per hour. So the Syracuse opera budget could be paid off in approximately 7 minutes, according to 7 minutes. And the entire collective budget of more than 150 opera companies in the U.S. in some 18 and a half days. By one individual. It's only one.
Yes.
One of a flock of such billionaires. So from the point of view of formal logic, the solution is obvious. Musk or some other billionaire who's less of a fascist imbecile than he is should just chip in a few dollars, and all the opera companies in America would be floating in cash. But I don't have to tell you, it doesn't work that way. In fact, their finances of these companies are getting worse and worse. And in fact, the support by philanthropists, billionaires and millionaires, is falling. Because we need something more than formal logic. We need dialectical logic here. Because the sort of society that produces such vast, unfathomable wealth is instinctively hostile to culture for a host of reasons. Even such small, paltry amounts are seen as a drain on the wealth that could go into their pockets. Like the French aristocracy before 1789, they don't intend to give up a single penny. They can't conceive of it. And they don't understand complicated artwork, and they have no sympathy for it. They're instinctively hostile and threatened by anything they don't understand. Governments in the United States at every level, funding of governments, state, local, federal, has dried up, either gone away completely or largely dried up, on the absurd basis that there isn't money for arts programs or education or healthcare or anything else. Private philanthropy, as I say, has fallen, even though those people are richer than ever. And in any case, art institutions, opera companies shouldn't be at the mercy of the rich. What if they like you one day and they don't like you the next? Why should artists be at the mercy of the millionaires and the billionaires? That's the aristocratic principle. That has nothing to do with a genuinely democratic society. So, obviously, I believe society should be reorganized so that the artists, technicians, directors, producers, freed from the pressure of the market, perform operas, thousands of operas, new ones, old ones, and the entire field will be rejuvenated. But the current situation is obviously disastrous for culture and arts in the United States. Again, take the example of Syracuse, just to pick on it. I know the area fairly well. It's in sort of central western New York State. It's a smaller city of 150,000 people or so, the metropolitan area of 600,000. It grew up, it became a city in the 19th century around the Erie Canal, which linked the middle of the United States to the East Coast, to New York and the East Coast. Syracuse became the home of auto manufacturing, General Electric, Carrier air conditioning, and all of that, or most of it, 80% of it, disintegrated in the 1970s and 1980s. Leaving economic decay, social decay, drugs, poverty, unemployment, like countless American cities, like the one I'm living near now, where I'm in Detroit area, which of course is even more emblematic of that process. I mean, in the 19th century, central Western New York State was home to various progressive social movements, public education, prison reform, abolitionism, women's rights. Frederick Douglass made, the great abolitionist, the great black abolitionist, made his headquarters in Rochester, New York, which is nearby Syracuse. The first women's convention in the United States took place in 1848, 50 miles away. So all of these things exist on the same historical plane. And cultural life in the post-Civil War period, when there was a certain blooming of democracy, a certain enthusiasm for democracy, you had then, at that point, 1870s, 80s, 90s, the growth of public libraries, museums, ultimately symphony orchestras, and probably later operas. I think I can't remember when the Syracuse Opera actually was founded, but a lot of them in the early 20th century. And in fact, Gustav Mahler conducted the New York Philharmonic in Syracuse in 1910 to show you how things have changed. And American capitalism was felt confident enough to promote cultural life, even to a certain extent, self-critical cultural life. I mean, I'm not trying to idealize it or glorify it, but it was a different atmosphere. There was a certain constituency for democracy and a certain conviction, real in some cases, perhaps pretended in other cases, that the population should benefit from a kind of cultural uplift, and that opera, music, libraries, books, the classics was part of that. Of course, there was always contradictory elements in that, as we know, but that was real, and that has largely vanished. That's vanished with the economic hegemony of the United States, with the industrial base. You have a kind of basically a bankrupt country which exists on the basis of the continued strength, continued power of the U.S. dollar because of its peculiar role in the world market. But it's a very, very different country and a very degenerated cultural and political climate. Again, the climate that produces a Trump and a Musk, how could it produce a healthy cultural climate? Or rather, it only produces a healthy cultural climate insofar as it's in opposition, insofar as it's in resistance. Anyway, that's my brief introduction. I'm sorry, it's probably more long-winded than I planned, but that's my answer to that question.
No, it's okay, because it gives us a very good picture, right, of the problem that the arts are facing in the United States.
And as you say, everywhere, really.
Yes, not everyone, really, yes. For example, in contrast, when you were, let's say, in elementary school, middle high school, what was the kind of artistic education students would be given?
Well, I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Greenwich Village, so I can't say it was completely typical of the United States as a whole. And I went to a progressive school because my father was a teacher there, and I went for free. I mean, it was very different. It's just interesting you asked that question because I was in preparation for this. I was thinking back to not that this speaks to the general cultural situation, but in those days, and I'm not trying to picture it wasn't the golden age, but it was a different period. You had on the big popular television shows, like for example, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was a very big thing when I was a kid. Came on late at night. It was a show for decades. He had on his show Robert Merrill, Jan Pierce, Richard Tucker, Sergio Franchi, Grace Bumbry, Roberta Peters, Pavarotti, Beverly Sills, Martina Arroyo, Marilyn Horne, and Placido Domingo. The Ed Sullivan Show, which was a very popular show on Sunday evenings, the list is just extraordinary. He had Franco Corelli, Birgit Nielsen, Joan Sutherland, Maria Callas, Leontine Price, Lily Pons. I could go on. Every name that they could, every major figure that was performing at the Metropolitan Opera would be on the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday night at some point or other. I'm not suggesting that opera was a household phenomenon or that, it was a mass phenomenon. No, it never has been in the United States. But the big names were in people's households. The music was in people's households on a weekly basis, in some cases a nightly basis. So the situation is quite different. I grew up, in the 50s, 60s, particularly early 70s. Of course, it was also the time of the sort of, I'm also speaking about this because I've just seen the Bob Dylan film recently. it was the period of the sort of folk music and popular music explosion in the 60s, and of course, so there were all sorts of conflicting trends and tendencies. But one of the great things, of course, of my childhood, although I didn't attend, was Leonard Bernstein's Young People's Concerts, which was watched by hundreds of thousands of millions of people when it aired on CBS on Sunday mornings. A friend of mine went to some of them. I did not. I think the cultural level has fallen. Let's put it that way. It's fallen sharply, not the fault of the population. You've also had the evisceration of arts education, music education, public education in general, and a general sort of degrading and lowering of the cultural level. I think that's temporary. I think things are going to change very dramatically, but that's bound up with politics and social life. But the atmosphere, again, I wouldn't idealize it or glorify it. I mean, they were very bad. They were very horrible aspects, the anti-communism, the Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis, all those very frightening things, It was a very tense atmosphere in many ways. But there was, in terms of the sort of official public culture, it was at a much higher level, much higher level. Look at the most popular films that in the United States last year, worldwide. It's a group of cartoons, superheroes. I mean, the films that would have been considered children's films 30 or 40 years ago dominate the box office. How is that possible? I don't blame the audiences. I blame the people who supposedly providing the culture, And of course, there are problems with the audiences, but that's not their fault. If you feed people pablum for decades and decades and decades, they're going to find it more difficult if you feed them boeuf bourguignon, But I think in the long run, if you expose people to more challenging and richer artistic work, they will respond to it. I think that's the lesson of history, I mean, and I think that would be the same in the United States or anywhere else. But people have to be exposed to it. They have to be aware of it.
So at the beginning of this century, in 2000, when the American opera by the American composer, the American opera, sorry, Dead Man Walking by American composer Jake Heggie became a success. American opera seemed to experience a revival. And there have been about more than 800 world premieres since that time. And apparently there are about 400 opera companies now in the United States of all sizes. Right? So what prompted this phenomena that now is experiencing a shrinking? Why is it at the beginning of the 21st century there seemed to be a sudden explosion, and now for the reasons that you mentioned, it's experiencing a contraction? But what caused this explosion to happen in the first place?
I'm not sure that I can answer that. I think you may have better ideas about it than I. I think I look back to that time. I mean, obviously there were growing dissatisfactions. There were also, let's see, what were going on. Of course, there was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all the propaganda about the end of history. There was the Clinton administration. Toward the end of the 1990s, there was a certain radicalization. There were some interesting things done in films too at the time, in fact. I mean, I'm not trying to paint some picture of some continual decline. I mean, there obviously are interesting people working, and there are interesting composers, there are interesting musicians working. How satisfying some of those operas were, I know you might have a better answer than I. I'm a little bit aware of Heggie's work. I'm not entirely enthusiastic about it, but whatever, I mean, there's people like John Adams and others. I suppose there was a sense, I don't know. I mean, I would imagine there was a growing sense of crisis in the opera world in the sense that increasingly opera halls felt like museums or mausoleums, with an age. I mean, I've been to the Metropolitan Opera, film where they show the HD film versions, and the audiences are, well, my age or older, It's a gray-haired audience, and that is a problem. I suspect there was a feeling among younger musicians that there was a need for a revival, uh, rejuvenation, that I mean, it seems to me that high musical skill and dramatic skill, that combination always has to have some role. I mean, it's so appealing and attractive and enormously powerful, drama and music, that there are continual attempts to kind of climb that mountain. Um, Again, how satisfying those products were, I don't know. I have my skepticism, but I'm not the expert that you are. And B, I think the problem is that the funding has been cut, that there's no, I mean, if the Metropolitan Opera is having difficulties, which it is apparently, with its hundreds of millions of dollars in its endowment fund, in other words, the difficulty is there is no room, there's smaller and smaller margin for experiment. We're taking a chance on a new opera, a new composer, because the consequences are so potentially disastrous. If you lose, it's the same in film. You have I mean, in a different way, but you have the production of more, the ideal in Hollywood really is if they had one blockbuster a year that cost $1 billion and made $50 billion. That would make them happy. No risk, no dangers, just one huge blockbuster. And that trend in culture is obviously devastating. But it seems to me opera is not, as the guy from the Syracuse Opera Company said, opera is not a cheap art. To do it seriously involves substantial resources, substantial skills, substantial musical, technical abilities, sets, presumably, although they can be done, I suppose, without that, costumes. I mean, it's a major undertaking. It can't be done without government subsidization. It can't be done seriously, not in the United States in any case. You can't depend on the market. You can't be thrown on the market and expect to produce serious art at this point. That's just not the way it works. And the general trend since the 80s, 90s has been to cut and cut and cut and cut subsidies. I think that's one of the major factors. And also, as I said, the decreased philanthropy. You have you don't have the respectable, liberal, sons and daughters of the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, the ones who sort of went into culture, The Rockefellers supported the Museum of Modern Art and those kinds of things. That you don't have those people. I'm not lamenting it, but you don't have them. You have Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and, Larry Ellison and Jeff Bezos and a horrible, horrible crowd of both Philistine, reactionary, dreadful people, utterly hostile to culture. They're not going to give any of their money to these things. So I think it's a combination of factors. And also, but again, also, I don't know, I'd have to study it. But to what extent have the new operas really filled the bill? Have they provided the artistic, social, emotional, psychological weight that's necessary? I have my doubts, but again, I'm not an expert. We just reviewed an opera, Grounded, at the Metropolitan Opera about someone who's a woman who's a drone pilot. And my colleagues seemed to think it was interesting. The music didn't do that much for me, but they thought it was an interesting conception, interesting production. So there are things. And also the one, oh God, I'm going to get the title wrong. The one based on the autobiography of Charles Blow about growing up in Mississippi in the 1920s. We also liked very much, in fact, a couple of years ago at the Metropolitan. So there are interesting things, but they're fairly few and far between, and they don't get support. They don't get government and private or public support, and that's a big problem.
Now, ever since I started being aware of basically TV, right, and all of the American TV shows that we got here in Mexico and American films, etc. I always seem to notice like a bashing down on classical music and opera. Every now and then there seems to be a negative comment against classical music and
Yep.
opera, and I will always keep wondering, well, why do they do this? What's the point? Because it seemed to me like a very calculated positioning of a negative comment against classical music and opera. And I mean, in financial terms, recording companies should have been the ones to be outraged by this kind of attitude, because if anything, Universal Music has made millions with, let's say, Wagner's Ring, right? Or Verdi. Why would Hollywood aim at, negatively speaking, classical music and opera? What's the motivation?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's universal. Obviously, I mean, not to make a pun, it's not universal. There are conflicting, positions on that. And as you say, they do, at a certain point, genuflect toward classical culture, and they make money out of certain things. And, and opera companies and symphonies continue. I think it's bound up with the anti-intellectual trends that exist in America, which is a very persistent and reactionary trend. What is it? Richard Hofstadter has a famous book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. It's not a new phenomenon. From my point of view, from the Marxist point of view, I would say it's a defense mechanism on the part of a ruling establishment that is very frightened of culture, thought, criticism, anything that makes human beings more flexible, more sensitive, more compassionate. They're frightened of. Why did the slave owners forbid slaves to learn how to read? There was a very specific social and political purpose. To read meant access to culture, meant access to ideas, meant access to a greater world, and ultimately opposition, resistance. I think there's an instinctive, as I say, the powers that be in general are hostile to critical thought, serious thought, challenging art, for obvious reasons. No, it's interesting. I have the same reaction because you see it on situation comedies and so forth, and it's always the working class guy is always thinks going to the opera is the most boring, most horrible thing in the world, just hideous, and it's terrible. It's horrible. I cringe when I see that kind of thing. It's deeply reactionary, and it's not even true. As you know perfectly well, opera at times has been very popular and been sung in the streets, and there's no reason why it couldn't be again. I think, again, it's complex, but ultimately it's a defense mechanism of a system that's very nervous about the population, thinking, feeling, growing deeply and becoming more complex. Keep them stupid, keep them dumb, keep them watching, Walt Disney and so forth. That's the general attitude, and now it's worse than ever. So yeah, I agree. It's horrible. Why do the recording companies put up with it? Well, they have sort of mixed feelings, probably. They take money out of one pocket and put it in the other. I mean, they make most of their money, however, on whatever it is today, rap and hip hop and so forth. And despite the cleverness and the verbal skills of some of those people, I think generally it's a pretty backward form, pretty backward and limited form. So they make their money out of that, you know. That's what they want to see thrive. They're not, they make certain money out of, if they can make money out of opera and classical music, fine, but that's not their mainstay, you know. It's a very cynical business. But anti-intellectualism is a real problem in this country.
Okay. And just to close our interview, what would a society without what we consider high art look like?
A society without?
Yes, without.
Well, look around. I mean, you know, that's what they're trying to create. Let's put it this way: you have a society in which high art, serious politics, serious intellectual life has been on the decline for decades, where there's been a terrible, in my view, cultural stagnation and regression. And you look around and see the results. A Trump, a Musk, for that matter, a Biden or a Harris, a degraded culture, degraded film industry, desensitized, sort of antisocial moods. I mean, look, you have a country where there are, you know, there have been hundreds of school shootings, mass shootings in workplaces of a psychopathic character, sociopathic character, where there's enormous confusion. People, it's not a fascistic society, and Trump isn't going to be able to introduce fascism, whatever he may think. But it's a very confused, disoriented society with millions of people at sea not knowing what to do. I don't know whether you followed recently, I'm digressing slightly, but the shooting of the CEO of a big health insurance company here in December, early December, I think it was. And there was this mass outpouring of sympathy for the people, for the guy who killed him. I must admit, I was even taken aback because there's so much anger, so much outrage against these companies and these corporations. And you know, some of the same people voted for Trump. It's a very confusing political situation. And they voted for Trump because they hated the Democrats, they hated inflation, they hated the wars, they hated all sorts of things. And you had two rotten parties, two rotten candidates. But it's very confused society, in many ways very disoriented. Obviously, I'm a socialist. I'm fighting for a working class response to this. And I believe a progressive way out of the crisis is possible. But in answer to your question, I would say, look around, look at the trends that are developing. That's what a society without serious art looks like.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.